Thank you all for having me here tonight. I'm very looking forward to this talk. As Bob mentioned, my presentation might be a little unconventional from what you're accustomed to here with some of the lectures on archaeology. But my area of research is within anthropology of tourism, and specifically I'm looking at two of the subfields of anthropology in order to understand tourism holistically. We know anthropology is relatively a broad science. It includes archaeology, which many of you are familiar with, as well as cultural anthropology, which is the ethnographic study of modern peoples, biological anthropology, which is the study of our biological selves, past and present, and then the fourth field is linguistical anthropology, which is the study of languages in time and space and across culture. My two areas of research are more or less separate domains in anthropology. In archaeology, I'm interested particularly in historical archaeology, which is the archaeology of societies that left written records, more or less in the New World or here in the United States. That would be sites that date back within the last 500 years since Europeans arrived. More specifically, though, I'm interested in the recent past, particularly Florida's recent past, only going back to, say, the 19th century up through the present. According to our state, anything over anything over 50 years old is historic. So I'm, for the most part, interested in sites, say, from, we could say the Gilded Age from about the 1880s up until about the 1950s and so forth. Primatology is also a study of field of anthropology, particularly the study of our non-human cousins in the animal world. If you're wondering what ethnoprimatology is, that is the study of the interaction between humans and non-human primates. So basically the relationship with humans and monkeys and apes and lemurs, cross-culturally and through time and space. And these two topics of mine are more or less separate areas, but they do converge when looking at Florida tourism. And what I'm doing is essentially looking at tourism through archaeology, which much of that involves excavating historic hotel sites, mostly middens. So looking at the material goods that were, say, furnishings in hotels, as well as, and more or less another way to put it, a garbage, waste that was disposed of from tourist facilities. Because this provides us a way to look at things like the accommodations that guests were given. It also helps us look into issues pertaining to social status and class, as well as things like foodways. What were tourists eating? What types of dishes were they eating off of? Was alcohol involved? And then we might ask questions like why and who and so forth. So those are a few of the things that we'll look at today. So how did I get interested in this unconventional area that I'm about to embark on and discuss with you? Well, I grew up in a town called Panama City Beach in Florida, which is on the Panhandle. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Panama City Beach. It's not necessarily an area known for having a lot of historical sites or archaeological sites, but we do have a few historic tourist attractions. Well, a couple left that haven't been demolished and paved over for newer development. One of them is, and it's still standing today, is Goofy Golf, which was founded in the late 1950s. And there's also another Goofy Golf in Fort Walton Beach. And this is just a site across the street from the Gulf of Mexico off the Miracle Strip. And every day on the school bus headed to Hutchinson Beach Elementary, we would pass Goofy Golf. Goofy Golf was also a part of my parents' childhood as well. And looking at Goofy Golf, I guess you could say technically it is a historic site, according to the state. But I think it captures a lot of what has changed about tourism, not just in Panama City Beach, but also in Florida as well. Moved from smaller attractions like this, more or less roadside attractions, to major large theme parks, and I'll discuss that later. But look at some of the things at Goofy Golf, and you'll notice that there's anthropological themes here, and I really believe that this heavily imprinted on my mind really got anthropology in my head. I mean, not only is it a historic tourism attraction, and I am studying historic tourism in Florida, but look at this. You have the Sphinx back here. Okay, so we have some relationship with archaeology and antiquity. We have this large monkey right here, so that's a tie-in with primatology and anthropology. Over here we have this old wooden house, which was sort of the haunted house at Goofy Golf, and being a historical archaeologist, I do excavations around houses that may not look too much different from this. And then of course we have the really big fish here, which we could say this reflects cultural anthropology, because cultural anthropologists study myths and folklores, and there's different cultures that have myths about big fish, right? So when we talk about the anthropology of tourism, just a few things to consider. Most of the work that anthropologists have done in tourism has been from the cultural folks. So anthropologists have studied modern people through ethnography. Starting about the 1970s, they started going overseas mostly, and they were already doing ethnographic research on cultures in various parts of the world. Well, it just happened to be that a lot of these cultures lived in tropical places, with sand, sun, and the beaches. And tourists were going here as well. So a lot of the anthropologists sort of hopped over from studying the indigenous people or the residents of these locales that they're doing their field work in, to studying the tourists that are visiting the locales, because they saw a good opportunity here to understand cross-culturally how do tourists interact with locals. Tourism is a very important thing to discuss for a few reasons. One, it's estimated, according to the World Tourism Organization, that about 1/3 of the world's worth of trade in goods and services comes from tourism. And I don't have to tell you all that here in Florida, tourism is a big deal. It is a big source of our tax revenue as well as employment. And it provides us with job opportunities, but at the same time, tourism can raise a lot of problems for us, like with traffic, dependence on tourism. When, let's say, people stop coming to an area for some reason, what do people do to survive? How do they make money? So I think it's a really important thing to discuss in that regard. And anthropologists and tourists do have a lot in common, because like tourists, anthropologists travel from place to place. They encounter different peoples. And the difference may be that anthropologists take it a little bit more scientifically, with more documentation, recording, and they're actually systematically studying these people. But I certainly wouldn't discount a tourist visiting a place overseas and the fact that, you know, they might have similar interests too, and they're going out to essentially learn about the people they're visiting. So maybe there really isn't that much difference there. How do we define, well, if we want to look at theoretical views of tourism, and I'm going to orient my laptop here so I can see this from this angle. Modern life creates feelings of alienation and inauthenticity in people's lives, as well as a longing for an escape to something that is real. The tourist seeks to transcend the pervasive influences of modern society. Tourism serves as a form of pilgrimage in which tourists socially and spatially separate from their normal residence and social environment. Tourists enter into a period of what we call liminality, in which their normal time, place, and familiar social conventions are suspended. So think about how this is transcended through marketing and advertising. Hence, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. People's normal social roles, their obligations, their duties, their behaviors change when they're in touristic settings. And we might want to ask, how can we see this archaeologically? And one of the ways I have to approach that is looking at alcohol consumption, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Tourists may bond with each other or with hosts, and this is referred to as communitas. And this is basically where groups of tourists travel together, sometimes groups of tourists that have family ties, friendship ties, or work ties, or just some other tie. Or sometimes they don't know each other until they come together in a tourist settings. Tourism brings people together socially. And socially, they live through these experiences. And that's essentially what we're doing in anthropology, is looking at people at the group or the cultural level. The things tourists do and the experiences they seek change over time. That's just simply a concern of anthropology in all of the fields. Obviously, in archaeology, we look at change through time, through the archaeological record. And if we study modern peoples, regardless of what culture or society that is, we can study them today, and we can look at how they may have changed from the past by looking at past studies done on these people. So people are not static. Things change over time. What are the origins of tourism? Where does it come from? Well, one of the earliest forms of tourism might date back to the Edo period in Japan. And this is basically where groups of Japanese, oftentimes, believe it or not, women and children tended to be the most common demographic here, but it also involved men too. They would go on tours basically to popular shrines that usually were on sacred areas or up on mountains. And what they would do was they would go and get some type of a souvenir. The word oshi in Japanese is their equivalent to souvenir, and this simply means token from a shrine. So the Japanese that went on these pilgrimages during the Edo period, they were essentially travelers and tourists because they were seeking a change in their life, they were seeking new experiences, and they were looking for something to bring back. Granted, it had more of a spiritual meaning, but I think today we even see people go on religious tours. I mean, look at people that go to, say, the Holy Land, and I mean not the theme park in Orlando that gets the tax break from the state, but they go to Jerusalem and Israel and so forth, and other countries where they might want to go have a religious experience. But sometimes I think tourism is just secular and people want to go get away from work and have a good time and drink. Another form of tourism was what we call the Grand Tour. And from about 1660 to 1840, upper-class males in Europe followed a tradition where they embarked on the Grand Tour. And this was basically an educational rite of passage where they would visit various sites throughout Europe and even going closer to the Middle East. And they would collect reliquaries or antiques. They would engage in various cultural activities, learn new languages, and bring something back. And again, this was reserved to pretty much the upper class social elite. And the demographic here was mostly upper class boys before they, say, went off to college. Okay, this is sort of what they did before reaching manhood, more or less. But in Europe, tourism wasn't necessarily relegated only to the upper class, and that you had working class people in England, starting in the industrial age, visit seaside resorts on the coast. So traveling, and there's certainly more examples of traveling and tourism we could talk about, but these are a few cross-culturally. The emergence of modern tourism, skipping ahead, came about in the late 19th century with the development of better forms of technology, such as steamships and trains, and later airplanes and automobiles. One of the major hotel builders were the people that put in railroads across the United States. They basically put in hotels wherever they put their railroads to. So railroad barons that had train lines going out from, say, the East Coast and large port cities in New England and New York out to, say, Appalachia or down to Florida or wherever, they would basically have trains go out and get raw materials to bring back to these coastal areas to basically use for building industrial cities. Well, these railroad barons, you know, they weren't stupid here. If they were going to spend the money to put a railroad line out to basically get raw materials from the countryside or the interior of the country to bring back, they wanted to make it as profitable as they could. So they would build hotels in the places they were extracting raw materials from, and they would take tourists out from the cities in, say, New York, in the northeastern United States, and they would basically send tourists out, have them stay in the hotels, and then they would bring raw materials back on those same trains. And I don't have to tell you probably that Henry Plant and Henry Flagler, two of the major railroad barons in Florida that had such a dramatic impact on developing our state's tourism industry, they developed several hotels throughout the state. And you have a couple in your region that we'll talk about in a little bit. And the archaeology of tourism has relatively been a new area of study. Over the summer, a special edition of the International Journal of Historical Archaeology was published, and it had nothing but articles on how archaeologists had studied tourism, how they had excavated at historic hotel sites. One of these was an article on Borscht Belt archaeology that looked at early Jewish tourism in the Catskills, and that's just one example. Uzi Baram, some of you might be familiar with him. He's a professor of anthropology at New College. He actually had an article in there on the Venice train depot, which is a little in Sarasota County in Venice. And he had New College students out excavating at the terminal here, which was a rehabilitation effort. They basically had fixed this old train depot up, and I believe it now serves as a bus station. But he had students out here excavating, and his article basically discusses how this was instrumental in expanding tourism into the southwest frontier or southeast frontier of Sarasota County. So there's some studies that have been done archaeologically on tourism, but more or less it's still a new area. But I think it's going to become more common as time passes. The social structure of tourism, well, when we look at who's involved in tourism, we have obviously the guest, the tourists themselves. There's various types. There's the explorer, who is motivated by the quest for discovery. Elite tourists that are usually higher status and go on more costly tours. And then we have mass and charter tourists, oftentimes middle and working class, who go in large groups and go on package deals. Although sometimes sometimes you might have people that are middle class spend more money, and you might have people that are higher class take a more modest trip. We also have hosts, which are the people that are directly employed in the tourism industry, people that own the hotels down to the workers, and the intermediaries such as the agents and so forth. And then we have host communities, and I think this is something important to look at, because when we talk about tourism and how it affects an area, it's just not the people that are working in tourism that are important to talk about, because tourism really affects communities. Because if communities are depending on tax revenue and money from tourism, or they're having to put up with traffic or competition from resources of tourism, or competing with beach space for tourists, it really involves them too. The tourist gaze was written by an anthropologist named Uri, who basically discussed how when tourists go and travel, they gaze on objects, they gaze on sights. And there's various types. There's the romantic gaze, the spectacular gaze, collective gaze, environmental, anthropological. And these just have to do with the way people look at sights. Do they romanticize over them? Or is it something they're just looking at as a spectacle? Do they gaze on sites with other people? And are they just there for the environment or the anthropological nature? Are they there for anthropological tourism, more or less? As an example of that is what we would call heritage tourism. The idea that people want to go visit an area not for necessarily the beaches per se or a theme park, but rather because of the people there and its heritage and culture. So there's various reasons why people go on tours, why they are tourists, and what they gaze upon. And then primate tourism is a new emerging area as well, and an area of interest of mine. It's a form of ecotourism. And primates, our closest cousins in the animal world, are they're threatened throughout the world through various things. The bushmeat trade, poaching, development, just all kind of stuff. And tourism has been seen as a way to try to create revenue to help support, say, preserves for primates. But the problem is a lot of primate tourism takes place in countries that have been devastated by wars or natural disasters. Sometimes they're not safe to go to, or even in places like South America where you've had the drug wars or economic strife, affect primates. It might be a way to help bring education. It might be a way to enhance educational efforts. But there can also be risks, because when humans come into contact with non-human primates, particularly ones that have been separated from them for a while, there can be diseases that are transmitted. But it is one thing I think to consider. Okay, let's get into Florida tourism, because that's what we really want to focus ourselves with today. As I mentioned before, tourism is Florida's largest industry in terms of the revenue it generates for the state and the jobs it provides. Much of the state's history is tied with tourism development. Prior to World War II, however, tourism was mostly known for its agricultural products. And some of you might know this is a familiar line of hotels on South Beach in Miami. And these date back to the 1930s, and they're actually considered historic in a sense. It's kind of interesting. The original, St. Augustine was probably perhaps the original area, the first area that tourists really came to in Florida, Euro-American tourists, that is. And then eventually people started to go to Jacksonville. But when these hotels came online in the 1930s, it really drew a lot of the tourists away from St. Augustine and Jacksonville in Northeast Florida. And I think at the same time, you probably had people coming to St. Pete in this area, maybe even a little bit earlier. And then tourism changes over time. Florida's newest theme park is Legoland, which is at the old Cypress Gardens in Polk County. And it's kind of interesting how I think a lot of people were kind of sad to see Cypress Gardens close down, because it was sort of a fixture in old Florida tourism. I mean, think about the Southern Belles on the water skis and so forth. Well, from what I've heard, and I think I've seen a picture of this, if you go to Legoland in Lakeland, you'll see a Lego version of one of the Southern Belles. A Southern Belle made out of Legos. But I think here's the important thing. If Cypress Garden couldn't survive, even though maybe some of that history's been gone, at least, and this is just in my view, it might be a good thing that this new park is at least remembering that history. So maybe kids that go who have no idea of Florida's past or history or tourism can ask mom or dad or their grandparents about who are these people made out of Legos supposed to be, and then they can talk to them about what tourism was like in the past. And again, that's at the heart of anthropology, is looking at changes in material culture and values and so forth cross-culturally. This is an ad from 1949 promoting the Florida vacation and how it never ends. Okay. So I think advertising is something interesting to look at that we can pair up with our archaeological data. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later on. Who was Florida's first tourist? Well, my interest here in tourism is mostly, like I said, from the 19th century to the early 20th century. I'm looking at mostly Euro-Americans and people, obviously, in the recent past. But many of the European explorers noted Indian trails to mounds and springs. For instance, William Bartram had observed these on some of his travels in the 1700s. So certainly Native Americans in Florida could have been tourists in themselves, because they may have taken pilgrimages to older mound sites that were built, say, a few thousand years before these trails were put in. Or the springs could have been a source of where they went to tour and visit. Okay? A little bit more recently, in terms of Euro-Americans, Tracy Revels is a historian that had a new book come out called Sunshine Paradise on the history of Florida tourism. It came out just last year. It's a really good book. And she credits Juan Ponce de Leon as the first tourist to Florida, because in a sense he was looking for the Fountain of Youth, and even tourists today go to the Fountain of Youth Archaeological Park. Of course, we know there really wasn't a such thing as the Fountain of Youth, but it is a real thing in terms of an attraction or a place with a sense of history. So if we think about tourists in Florida, we could maybe think of him as one of the earliest. And of course, the native peoples before Ponce de Leon. Florida springs were a major draw of tourists. It was a belief in the early 1800s that springs could cure various ailments. And it was very popular for people who, say, lived up north during the winters, who had various ailments, who were sick, etc. There was a belief that if they came down to Florida and they stayed at a resort near the springs were good for healing. And I believe the spot at Safety Harbor was one of these types of spring-based resorts, and that's what up in Tarpon Springs, the northern end of the county. Operators in these spring-based resorts made claims that their healing waters were efficacious in all forms of consumption, scrofula, jaundice, and other bilious affections, chronic dysentery and diarrhea, diseases of the uterus, chronic rheumatism and gout, neuralgia, tremors, syphilis, ringworm, and just itch. So it's believed that springs had curative healing powers. On the left here is the old bathhouse at White Sulphur Springs, and that's in North Florida. And they basically had a wood frame 4-level pavilion that encircled the springs here. And this is no longer standing. And then center is the old bathhouse at Wekiva Springs, and this is in northwest Orange County near Apopka. And it was considered one of Orlando's earliest tourism attractions. So springs, in many ways, were the first areas that tourists visited in Florida. It was one of the first theme parks and attractions. And think about it, it's something that already exists naturally. It requires very little modification. So we put all this money into building major theme parks today, changing the landscape and et cetera. But think about it, tourists pretty much were just happy to see what we had then. It's interesting to think about. And then on the right here, you still have tourists visiting springs. But where I think ecotourism is a little more common, where you have people visiting the manatees annually, usually around, February, March, that migrate up here. Another form of early tourism, besides visiting springs and coming to Florida for health and healing, Florida was a sportsman's paradise. You had basically sometimes couples, but generally groups of men, usually middle or upper class, would come down on steamboats or through the railroad, and they would basically go hunt, and they would just go shoot and hunt just about whatever they could get. Alligators, birds, deer, etc. And you see some historic paintings of illustrations. This is, I believe, alligator hunting off the St. John's. I think this might be on the St. John's as well, I'm not sure. Here's an old postcard from Palm Beach, Florida, showing a pretty large alligator being caught. And many of the early sportsmen, I mentioned that, they traveled as couples or sometimes through families. And this is interesting. During this time, the emerging American middle class began to view travel and tourism not as a sinful waste of time, but as a natural complement to labor. Travel to Florida, though, was difficult as rail service was limited, though many of the early sportsmen arrived by boat. Things would change, however, when automobiles came in. Just to talk a little bit about sportsman tourism, this is the Oakland hotel site, and this is in Orange County. Now, this hotel no longer exists, but it is within a few blocks of Lake Apopka, which was once Florida's second and then third largest lake, but it's shrunk a little bit since late 19th century land modifications. Lake Apopka was known as one of the best places for freshwater fishing in the United States, and there was a whole fishing industry based on Lake Apopka. By the way, again, Lake Apopka is in northwest Orange County, about 10 miles northwest of Orlando. It was built in 1910, and it was a 3-story wood frame hotel that housed about 75 guests. It had progressive amenities of the day because it had toilets with running water, and it had electricity and lights, which was a big thing back in those days. We actually conducted excavations at the Oakland hotel site where I brought my Valencia college students out. That was done a couple of years ago, and we're in the process now of analyzing the artifacts, which there was a pretty big assemblage excavated from the site, and this will be one of my dissertation sites. But looking at the archaeology that was done here, we did about 20 to 30 shovel tests on the property. Let me back up here. This part of the house no longer exists. This part was torn down around 1947. However, there's a house right here that connected to the hotel that was actually built 20 years before the hotel. This house right here was built in 1890, and when the hotel was built next to it in 1910, this small house became the kitchen house and dining hall for the larger hotel. When the hotel was torn down, this small house here that was the kitchen house was reverted back to being a private home for a family. And the family that owns the house today allowed me and my students to come out and excavate at the site. And the property they have is only about an acre, so there wasn't a lot of space for shovel testing. But there was very dense deposits of trash and garbage buried here. We only put in one excavation unit, which was a 1 by 2 meter unit. But we got lucky here because our 1 by 2 intersected 3 different trash deposits that you can really see distinctively. So there's one right here, there's one right here, and then there's one right here. Okay, so it was really cool in terms of what we could capture just out of such little space. And I can tell you that the amount of materials that came out of this, took up about 4 to 5 48-gallon bins. That was just how much material was buried. Some of the things we recover, some of the artifacts we recover from the site, include various things that the tourist and guest at the hotel would have used. Most of them date to the 1930s. We really didn't find any 1920s materials, and they possibly may have been buried in another area of the yard that now has a structure over it, or they simply may have been disposed of off-site. In my experience of excavating at historic home sites to this period, we tend to find, it seems like most of the materials we find tend to be from the 1930s and 40s, but a lot of that earlier deposits and waste, say from the 1910s or 20s when the house was first built, we rarely find that stuff. And I think what happens is, in Florida, sometimes the house from the 1910s or 20s was the first one in the neighborhood or on the block. So when people wanted to throw their stuff out, they could just throw it out in the woods or some undeveloped lot. Well, as the area started to build up and lots were purchased and houses were built, you no longer could really dump that stuff out across the street because there was a house there. So then you had to put it on your own property. And places like, this is in the town of Oakland, which is one of Orange County's most historic towns. They didn't get municipal garbage pickup until 1949. And so for a lot of small communities, small cities in Florida, people buried their waste up until even the 1950s. At my 1946 block house in Gainesville, every time I try to do landscaping, just stuff from the 1950s comes up. Whereas in larger cities, trash pickup came on a little earlier. We know in the city of Orlando in 1897, the city had horse-drawn carts pick up trash from people's yards. So larger cities were able to pick up trash at an earlier date. Smaller cities came on later. What we say is what's maybe trash for one person is the treasure for archaeologists. Not treasure in that sense that we like to think of treasure hunters, but they can really tell us a lot about people's lives. Anyway, let me get back to the artifacts now that I sort of gave you that context. Some of the most common things we found at the site are there's a lot of alcohol, and most of it tends to be very lower end whiskeys and wines and liquors. It's sort of what you would call the wine of the box of the day. Just really nothing extravagant or spectacular. The dishes were very plain, very utilitarian ironstone hotel china dishwares. Really nothing fancy or out of the ordinary here. What you would find in any type of institutional facility, even up until today, was found at the hotel. Very thick dishes. I mean, think about it. If you're serving, think about the clientele here. This was mostly fishermen that were staying at the hotel to fish on Lake Apopka. So they were probably getting drunk, possibly rowdy, and they weren't necessarily coming down where they wanted to be impressed with fancy porcelain or Limoges dishes. So utilitarian ceramics was what food was served on. We did find a lot of these milk glass, small glass containers. They sort of look like Pond's cold cream vessels, which was kind of interesting because we don't necessarily think, this one might show women were a greater part of the experience than we thought. But this also could have been some type of emulsion for the men that went out on the fishing boats and came back sunburned. It could have been some kind of a moisturizer, some type of a lotion, so we're not really sure. And then one thing we found from the middens is a lot of animal bones. And what's interesting, a lot of the stuff is coming directly from Lake Apopka. Lake Apopka, even going back to prehistoric times, up until its ecological decline in the 40s, was known for having large game fish populations and being a popular place to get alligator and turtles. And in the middens, we find a very large predominance of large fish, alligator, and turtle. But we also find some domestic animals as well, some chicken, pork, beef, stuff you'll usually find on a historic site. This is interesting. I love looking at old advertising and looking at it in the context of the artifacts we find. And one of the common types of liquor we found was something called Old Quaker straight rye whiskey. This isn't actually one of the bottles we found from the site because all the labels had already perished, you could say, after being in the ground for 60 or 70 years. But this is one I found a picture of a vintage bottle somebody saved. And I found this advertisement for Old Quaker going back to, I think this is 1937. But look at, this really tells you a lot about things like social class and the experience of the hotel. The ad says, "You don't have to be rich to enjoy rich whiskey. Brothers, don't you want to save your dimes? In penthouse, prairie, factory, and farm, millions are finding there's a barrel of quality in every bottle. It bears a Schlenny mark of merit." So this is kind of interesting because this is showing you that this kind of whiskey is, well, for one thing, reserved mostly to middle-aged Caucasian males, but it cuts across class lines. I mean, you have the guy from the penthouse, the guy in the factory, and the farm, all sort of pictured here together, saying that anybody can enjoy this whiskey, and it really is sort of like the equalizer. So then we might ask a question, well, what does this mean when we find a lot of this type of whiskey at the Oakland Hotel site, and what does this tell you about the drinking experience? So something good to keep in mind there. This is interesting too. Here's an advertisement for the Oakland Hotel, and I believe this is from around somewhere in the 1910s. An ideal place to spend the winter on Lake Apopka, finest fishing in Florida. Yet, just a few decades later, Lake Apopka started to look like this. In the 1980s, Lake Apopka was considered Florida's most polluted lake. And just to give you a very quick, brief rundown or explanation of this, in 1941, about 20,000 acres of farms were established on the north shore of the lake, where basically marshland, marsh habitat, was converted to farms. Remember, this was during World War II when there was food rationing in place. There was concerns over having food shortages in this country. So we really wanted to encourage farmers to basically grow a lot of food so our country would survive and be prosperous. Well, it totally wrecked the ecology of this lake because the marshes was just so important for filtering out the lakes, for maintaining its healthy balance, that the ecology crashed. And by about 1950, people stopped fishing here. And then the tourism industry that was such a big part of Lake Apopka pretty much just went away almost overnight. And even till today, when you ask people about Lake Apopka, they say, well, it's kind of a dirty, a polluted lake. I would never fish out of there. You never see boats on it at all. Yet you'll see people on boats and water skis in various other lakes in Orlando. So it's lost that significance here in the community, and really the region as a whole. The good news is in the 1990s, the state government bought up all of those muck farms. So basically all of the marshland that was converted to farms in 1941, muck farms were put in, and those were basically high productive, high output farms where they got about 3 crops of vegetables a year. And what they would do is just put tons of fertilizers and pesticides down, and then that would go into the lake, and then they would keep pumping water out of the lake and onto the fields. So it was a cycle of dirty water going into the farms and fields. But in the 1990s, the state bought up all of these muck farms, and they've been undergoing restoration. The good news is, since these farms were bought up, the water clarity has improved and the phosphorus levels have declined. The game fish populations are starting to rebound, and then the harmful trash fish populations, like the gizzard shad, are actually starting to decline as well. So Lake Apopka is getting better, and it may be a few more generations until it's like this again, but it's a story that I think we'll see success eventually at. Now, the way we tied archaeology into this was, and unfortunately I don't have any pictures of the Oakland Nature Preserve, but the Oakland Nature Preserve is on the southern shore of Lake Apopka, and we sort of have a relationship with the Oakland Nature Preserve as your chapter has with Weeden Island. It's a place that's dedicated to cultural and natural history, and we have an archaeology lab and a museum on site. And when the preserve brought us on board, their whole mission is about educating people about Lake Apopka. But before we came on board and they knew about us doing archaeology in Oakland at other sites, they thought it would be a really cool idea to have us involved in their educational efforts. Because if you want to teach people about the environment, you have to put people in the equation. If you want to understand why the environment crashes and how to fix it, you cannot do that without understanding the role of humans here. So one thing we did was we created an educational exhibit on early Florida tourism, where we had people in the community bring in some of their vintage fishing tackle, old photographs of large game fish that were caught from Lake Apopka, and then some of the artifacts from the Oakland Hotel site that were excavated. And this is really a way to bring back consciousness in people that, hey, this is not just some big lake that's pretty to look at. This is something that people spent leisure time around. It brought in tourism, it supported jobs, it supported a whole fishing industry. And there was tourism in Orlando before Walt Disney World, and a lot of people don't really understand that, and it really blows people's mind. Now, I don't necessarily need to go dig up trash from an old site to make that point, but I really think by doing that, it only enhances the point better. Because if we were just to get up on the soapbox and show people pictures, say, oh, Lake Apopka used to be a healthy lake, why don't you believe me here? They say, oh, well, that's cool, that's interesting. But I think the process of doing archaeology and showing artifacts just makes it more exciting, it makes it more tangible. And so I get really excited about talking about this, and it was a sort of a theme of our FAS conference last year. But I do want to move on because there's a few other things I want to discuss. We're also doing ethnographic research at the Oakland Hotel site, or sorry, not in the Oakland Hotel site, in Oakland, where we've actually had a few cultural anthropologists like Tiffany George, a former student of mine, basically doing interviews with people using the West Orange Trail, which is a 30-mile bike trail that goes through the nature preserve and through Oakland that used to be a railroad line. So it's a rails to trails. It was part of a Rails to Trails program. And she also has been interviewing people visiting the Oakland Nature Preserve. So the idea is to look at tourism in the past through archaeology and compare it with tourism of the present through ethnography. And to me, this is a really good example of doing holistic anthropology. So skipping ahead, Florida, besides being a place that attracted fishermen and hunters, it was also a winter playground for the elite. So we talked about Henry Flagler and Henry Plant, how they basically brought the railroads down, and they built all these elite resorts that served as a place where wealthy people, particularly from the Northeast and usually the North, came down to winter at. One of the most famous ones was the Ponce de Leon Hotel, which is now Flagler College in St. Augustine. You guys have this here in your region. Was at the Tampa Bay Hotel, built by Plant, that is now University of Tampa. And then this one here, what is this? Oh, this is the Breakers on Palm Beach, and that actually still exists. That's actually still a hotel today. One that I had just recently learned about that I would like to see before it disappears is Henry Plant's Bellevue Biltmore, and I believe this was built in 1896. And from what I understand, this is a big issue now here in Pinellas County because there's people that want to destroy it, and it's brought out a lot of people fighting in the community. A lot of people don't want to see it torn down. It represents a part of the past that's really important for this community's history. Other people are saying, well, you know, property rights, it's falling apart, all this stuff. So I don't know that much about the issue to comment, but it is a real life issue there. And it does represent, I think the article I read said that this was, I think, one of the last remaining large wood frame hotels from this era. So I would like to actually go see it before it gets demolished, but I really hope it doesn't get demolished because it seems like just such a cool part of, you know, your community, actually our state's history and heritage that, yeah, so I need to learn more about this, but I thought I would put that up here just to sort of bring in a local emphasis here. I've actually done research at the Fort George Club, which is on the Kingsley Plantation site in Fort George Island. And I'm a student of James Davidson, who actually does historical archaeology out here, mostly looking at slave life from the 1700s and early 1800s. But this Fort George Club was established on the plantation in the 1920s as an Army-Navy club, and then later an elite social club. And basically the Fort George Club was dumping all their trash in the 30s over the slave cabin areas where my advisor was excavating. But because they're historic artifacts, and because this is part of the national park system, those artifacts have to be studied, cataloged, curated. So that's sort of where I was brought in to board here. And this is what really got me interested in studying tourism through archaeology. It's actually an interesting site to work at, I believe. Some things from the Fort George Club. Now this is interesting. The ceramics are totally different from what you see at the Oakland Hotel site. They're contemporaneous, they date to the same period, but you see ceramics with more decorations here, not that utilitarian whiteware. So my idea is that this might represent more of like a bed and breakfast type atmosphere, or a club that's more informal where people want furnishings that look like what you would have in your home versus something in an institutional hotel. However, the liquor really wasn't anything spectacular at the Fort George Club. They were drinking low-end wines and liquors and etc. So it's interesting to compare the two sites. And this, by the way, is at Kingsley Plantation. These are the footprints of some of the slave cabins that are no longer standing. Here's a few that are still standing. Becky O'Sullivan back there has worked here at Kingsley Plantation. And so that's just to orient you with it. One other thing was, it was interesting, there's actually a dump from 1955 on the grounds of the plantation in the middle of the woods that represents, this is the year the state purchased the plantation site from the Fort George Club to turn into a historic site. The National Park Service acquired it in 1991. But this is interesting because this is all the stuff that like the state was throwing out from the old hotel or the old clubhouse and the bungalows. And you see a lot of Clorox bottles and cleaners because it sort of represents a purification ritual where they're sort of cleaning up this elite Army social club and turning it into a historic site with public interpretation. So that's interesting to look at archaeologically. One other site I'm looking at now is a Thomas House West Orange Club. It was also like the Fort George Club, but in West Orange County. And we've done work out there recently. And then the arrival of the tin cans come. This is, tourism really changed around the period of when automobiles started to become more affordable. Highways were built throughout Florida. And now people who, because you have to remember, but when people could only come down here through steamboats and through trains, those were costly. The average American couldn't afford that. But when cars became more affordable, or people spent all their money they could on a car, they could travel down to Florida and stay in these what they call tin camps. And they were called tin can tourists because they oftentimes brought all the food they needed with them in tin cans. Other people say, well, the cars they drove were kind of like tin cans. So I think the historians sort of have mixed interpretations here. But they were a form of tourism, and it brought a new demographic of visitors into the state, no longer the wealthy and the elite and so forth. Florida during the Depression kind of suffered because stock market crashed, people became unemployed, and Florida tourism operators were in crisis. But one thing that saved them was the fact that many of the hotels were used for training people in the military, soldiers in the military, because this is, right before World War II. So that is probably the one thing that saved the tourism industry in Florida during the Depression. and into the 1930s was that the military basically used the tourism infrastructure in Florida. They used the beaches for training, such as here on Miami Beach, all these soldiers training, and they used old hotels to house soldiers in that were down here for training, such as the Boca Raton Resort. And then you had roadside attractions pop up. So you have all these roads going into Florida, such as the famous Orange Blossom Trail, which goes through all of Central Florida's orange groves and connects to various springs. And it's Orange Blossom Trail, if you're familiar with Orlando, isn't as pleasant as it once was, per se. I can just leave it at that. Yeah. But one of the attractions off the Orange Blossom Trail was Gatorland, and it's still one of Florida's oldest roadside attractions that still stands there. And Weeki Wachee was another famous one in Hernando County. We have the mermaids here. And basically all of the attractions had some kind of a theme, like jungle, garden, zoo, historical, novelty, or aquatic related. And the Florida Attractions Association was formed in 1949, and it regulated these. And if you were if you owned a roadside attraction and you were a member of the FAA, the rules you had to abide by was your attraction was near a major highway, you charged admission, you operated for profit, you utilized some gaudy promotional materials, and you related the attraction to Florida's flora or fauna. And we can sort of see that's sort of related, but you know, mermaids don't really exist in reality in Florida, but it's kind of complementary to that theme. And another thing was, and this is where we get into primates and monkeys and apes. Monkeys and apes were a big part of Florida tourism attractions. We started to see monkeys and apes come in really around the 1920s, but really we started to see a big increase around the 30s and in the 1940s. And these popped up all over Florida, and this is one thing I'm in the process of studying. You had, for instance, a chimp farm in Dania in Broward County. You had Jungle Larry's Safari Island, which is now Naples Zoo at Caribbean Gardens. I think this is Noel's Chimp Farm, which was in Palm Harbor, and I believe Tarpon Springs, and it's now Suncoast Primate Sanctuary, right? Okay. And another one is here, the zoo at Sanford, Central Florida Zoo at Sanford, north of Orlando. And it's just sort of interesting to look at these things. I mean, I like the marketing here. See Africa in America. So we're taking Florida and we're just making it even more exotic for the tourists. We're basically taking people that can now afford automobiles, who are working class, who have been granted industrial jobs through the New Deal in the 1930s. And now for the first time they could bring their families down to tourism, to Florida, and they were tourists. This was a new tourist demographic in our state. And so what I'm looking at in my research was how tourist operators took advantage of this and wanted to make exotic attractions. I think another one here in Pinellas County is Sunken Gardens. That was a roadside attraction, and I believe they had monkeys on display as well as other exotic flora and fauna. Monkey Jungle was another famous one. It opened in 1933. This is in Homestead, and it still operates today. It's part of something called the Historic Redlands Tropical Trail, which is sort of a chain of historic tourist attractions in Homestead. Another one, I believe, near it is Coral Castle, which is that castle built out of Florida coral, and Fairchild Gardens. And this is intriguing to me. It's tourism of tourism. Not only tourists going to old sites that are old tourist attractions, but tourists going to see what old tourism was like. And we see this in this area as well as other areas of our country. Out in New Mexico, it's a big thing, where tourists are actually seeing some of the original sites, the original tourist Pueblo sites. But Monkey Jungle is kind of an interesting place, and I like looking at these postcards because it shows cage spectators observing the monkeys that play. And the idea at Monkey Jungle is that you're the one in the cage, and the monkeys, there's nearly 400 monkeys and apes on the property on 30 acres. There's a big perimeter fence that surrounds it, and then you go on the property through like a cage tunnel. So you're in the cage there. But to me, this is just one of those old attractions that still operates today. This is from Musa Isle. This was an old jungle cruise, these jungle cruise rides were really popular in Florida. A modern analog is to think about the jungle cruise at Disney's Animal Kingdom or at Magic Kingdom. However, instead of having animatronics and charging $70 to $80 for entrance, these jungle cruises would basically take people on a natural river in Florida And usually you had a captain who would dress up in a captain outfit. And he would take people on these cruises as if they were going through the Amazon in South America or somewhere in Africa, some exotic locale. And what they would do is on a little island in the river, they would place monkeys on there. Other things they would do was they would sometimes hire Seminole Indians to create an authentic, quote unquote, Indian village on site for tourists to see, such as Musa Island. And sometimes if they had archaeological mounds or sites nearby, they would show tourists that too. So this is real anthropological when you look at all these things converging. One of these still exists. This is at the Homosassa River. There's actually a historic monkey island that's still in operation. That's it's part of a resort / restaurant, and they have a troop of spider monkeys that live on the island. This is up near De Leon Springs. And if any of you are familiar with De Leon Springs in Volusia County, this is where they have the famous pancake house, where on the tables they have a hot griddle and they serve you, pitchers, stoneware pitchers with batter in there, and you make pancakes on them. They actually had a hotel that was once on the site before it was a state park, and they had a jungle cruise. In fact, one of the interpretive signs talks about the Monkey Island Trail that'll take you past the Monkey Island. And there's actually the ruins of the old Monkey Island at De Leon Springs right here. So you could say a little archaeology of a roadside attraction, a little archaeology of Florida monkeys that were part of Florida tourism. I find all kind of interesting ways to really bring anthropology in. One other interesting thing was the Silver Springs monkeys. And they've been in the news recently because the state has begun to issue permits again for harvesting them. Just to talk real quickly about these, in 1938, Colonel Toohey had this jungle cruise at Silver Springs, and he released several rhesus macaques on an island near the Silver River to attract tourists to his jungle cruise. And the rhesus macaques are native of India, Southeast Asia, China, Pakistan, and their population pretty much exploded since 1938. So what was once about a dozen or so rhesus macaques on this little island in the river, about 200 to 300 now live within the vicinity of Silver Springs. They are a very hardy, a very adaptable primate. They're the most widely distributed primate besides humans across the world. They can live everywhere from up to the Midwest to hot tropical climates. They're not necessarily a harm for wildlife or native plants in Florida, but the state has begun to issue permits for $150 to have these monkeys harvested. Again, there's about 200 to 300 of them. And the monkeys are sold to biomedical research laboratories where they could be worth several $1,000s each. And there was an article recently in the Gainesville newspaper, Gainesville Sun, and the Orlando Sentinel about this, because this has created a lot of controversy in the community because a lot of people don't want to see the monkeys harvested. Many of the locals, as well as tourist operators, have no problems with them. There's hardly any reports of them damaging wildlife, biting or attacking people, spreading disease. And people have been in outrage about the state's hiring people to harvest them. The article mentioned that they might also be eating some nuisance plants, but it's like air potato and wild taro. But it's a very tough issue. There's a lot of ethical issues going on here, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I think this is important to talk about because one, this is anthropological, two, it ties in Florida history, and then it also looks at tourism. So what was once a roadside attraction or a jungle cruise has kind of created a modern situation where you have these creatures just living in troops of, dozens or hundreds, in this area. And I think it's kind of an interesting issue to look at in that regards. And then not just monkeys. Okay, I'm going a little far away here, but I do have to talk about Snakeatorium because this was the big roadside attraction in Panama City Beach when I was a kid. It closed down around, 1992. It's now Zoo World, which is kind of like a small zoo. But Snakeatorium was opened in 1946, and they basically had, it was mostly, they didn't have any monkeys here, and if they did, they probably were eaten. But their big thing was snakes, obviously. It's called Snakeatorium. But they also had giant alligators, pythons, and they even had a Satan, the friendly leopard. They were also selling pets for sale, pet snakes, caimans, raccoons, and skunks that you can go play with. So that's an interesting thing, I think, in terms of a roadside attraction to look at. And you know, just to talk about the culture of Panama City Beach, this is kind of was our historic site. So that and Goofy Golf. The Miracle Strip amusement park, you know, closed down about 10 years ago, which was kind of sad. But and then primate tourism in Florida is a little bit different. It's less oriented towards roadside attractions, and more or less they bring in a lot of educational efforts. Like at Disney's Animal Kingdom, conservation is a big thing. You know, they charge $80 or $90 to get in, but you know, they teach people about threats to various animals, not just apes and primates and monkeys, but other animals as well. And it's a good opportunity. I actually have students here from my anthropology classes go and observe some of the apes as well as some of the monkeys at Animal Kingdom and some of the other zoos. So it's a good source now for education, not just entertainment. And then we have the land of make-believe, which comes in. And Bob kind of gave me this idea when he invited me to prepare a paper for a conference and for a publication a couple years ago. Tourism just dramatically changed when Disney World came in 1971. And Florida's sort of gone away from these attractions that featured the state's natural or cultural history, or something kind of closely related like monkeys and mermaids, to something that was just totally different and foreign, such and fantasy-based, like Cinderella's Castle, Planet Epcot, Shamu. These are things that are very far from Florida's natural and cultural history. And I'm not necessarily criticizing that, saying it's a bad thing, but I think we can all agree that's definitely a change. It's definitely a change symbolically in the earlier form of tourism. These attractions and other features ushered in a new era for Florida theme parks. It had little to do with Florida's tropical aura, and rather they focused on an experience that was sanitized, it was based on simulated reality. And basically what happened to the roadside attractions was that when I-4 and the Turnpike were constructed, tourists were basically diverted away from these old attractions like Gatorland, which really suffered and was hit hard. Cypress Gardens was hit hard. All these a lot of them closed down because people were taking the major highways now to the major attractions. And to me that's interesting to look at in terms of how transportation and how we get people from place to place can dramatically have another effect on other areas of our social structure, mostly other areas of tourism. And then this is a last slide. I sum it up with sunshine, booze, and monkeys. And the thing I'm looking at in my research, and I'm still kind of ironing out some of these ideas, but just kind of go with me here. During the Great Depression in 1929, we all know about the stock market crash. And people went out of work. America's psyche was kind of down. But people made it through. We pulled through, obviously. But in 1933, two things happened. Alcohol was made legal again. Prohibition was repealed. And King Kong debuted, although King Kong's an ape, not a monkey. And I'm looking at these two things, how the relegalization of alcohol and the popularity of monkeys and apes in American culture, these things, Florida tourism operators took advantage of these to basically bring people down to take vacations to Florida. And these were basically cost-effective ways to have people have a good time and people to enjoy themselves. And they did this by serving cheap liquor and booze at their hotels. And at the time, primates were very inexpensive to add to a roadside attraction. Now, nowadays, if we talk about proper and ethical care of monkeys and apes, it can go in the, you know, it's not a cheap thing. But in those days, with concrete cages and metal bars and really poor care, it wasn't expensive. And then you had this new demographic of tourists that were now traveling in cars, who were working class, they were bringing families down, they were cost conscious. And during the Depression, when people are sad and they're feeling down, what makes you feel good? Well, sunshine is one thing, but also alcohol and monkeys. And so that's, and of course, I don't want to make those are just generalizations because not everybody likes alcohol. Some people don't like to drink. Some people shouldn't drink. Not everybody likes monkeys and apes. But it is, I think, something that really captured the imagination of people and really enhanced the experience in Florida. So I think that's all I have for there. But thank you. Thank you. So,